So welcome. Can you introduce yourself?
Okay. My name is Erlinda Gonzales. My family name was Gonzales. I married Ed Berry in 58 years ago this month because I miss home. I came here. I did my work. Was a school teacher, and then I went back to college after my daughter was born and did a master's degree, and then I went on and did a PhD degree. I had to really struggle to get accepted. I mean, a lot of in my other book, Paletitas de Guayaba, I talk a lot about the issues. It's a Spanish book. It's been translated. I can send you a copy of that, and all the issues of a woman trying to make, and especially a woman of color trying to make it in the system, and the stuff that we had to deal with, and the chauvinism, the racism, and but I did get through the PhD and ended up. They didn't want to accept me originally. Oh, they didn't want to give me a teaching assistantship because supposedly, and this is a note in my file, I was a New Mexican and probably spoke New Mexican Spanish. Well, I went to one of my professors and I said, "Listen, I'm your student. You know what I'm capable of." He was our Canadian, but was like a Argentinian, and he wrote a message right away. She said, despite the fact that she's a New Mexican, her Spanish is excellent. And so I got into the program, did a PhD, ended up being probably their second star pupil. There was one guy before me that was, and went on to teach colleges, Earlham College, New Mexico State, and ended up back at the University of New Mexico. They don't like to hire their own graduates, but they did. So I went there and then spent 18 years there, and then came to Oregon. Job opened up here as a chair of a brand new ethnic studies department. And I thought that would really be a challenging way for me to end my career. And I applied for the job and came here in 97. I was 10 years in that position. And it's a big change from being in New Mexico. First of all, I was teaching, Chicano culture and Latin American literature and stuff. And I came from New Mexico, where I knew what the identity was with the thing. And I'd use the word Chicano here, and the students would say, "Well, I'm not a Chicano, I'm a Mexican." So I had to change my whole perspective, and I started researching Mexican migration to Oregon, and have a book called Mexicanos in Oregon: Their Stories, Their Lives. It's a more academic publication. So that's how I ended up here, thinking I will go back home. I will go home as soon as I can. And I'm still here. My husband is very, very happy and very comfortable here. He doesn't want to move. He spent 30 years in New Mexico. He's from the East Coast. He's from New York. And I figure, well, I owe him 30 years. I think I have 4 more to go, and then I can go back home. No, I'm just kidding. But we're here to stay. This is a fabulous little town for old people. It's easy, The doctors are 10 minutes away. The hospital's 10 minutes away. So we're here. Yeah.
So that's interesting. So were you kind of able to see, I saw that you initially graduated from UNM in 1964. From that time period to like 1997, when there was an new ethnic studies college or major division. And then after that, even 10 years past that, what did you notice about sort of the evolution about how the perspective on Chicano literature, or just how the way that was all framed? I mean,
well, at the University of New Mexico, in the Spanish department, was languages, and then it went to Spanish. It was pretty much, Spain and Latin America, and my field was Latin American literature. But we had some people before, Ruben Cobos, and they had started when the soldiers came back from the war, and they were taking courses on their GI Bill, and they were the Hispano soldiers, and they would take Spanish classes. So they started to design classes specifically for them, to accommodate the variant, and to the local variant, and to expand their Spanish skills. So they started that program. I studied under it in '64. And then when I went back to as a graduate student, I taught in that program, and we just kept developing it, and ultimately ended up being called the Savinu Libarri Heritage Language Program, I think is what they call it now. And so we just opened the doors up for our people, for our students to come and be empowered through the study of language. It was really important to all those students who came through our department. And then we started to, when I went to do my dissertation, my director, she was my mentor. She said, she's from Russia originally, Latin Americanist. And she said, you know, this Chicano literature stuff's really starting to happen. I think you ought to do your dissertation on that. So I did. And that opened the doors for me to help create a field, because we did. And then we hired Diana Rebolledo, and she was a fierce fighter, feminist and Chicano all the way. And we struggled in that department and in that university. And little by little, we started to build it, bring in some of our students to the PhD program, build the language program, teach Chicano literature, and really built a solid program there. And then it developed everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just telling you that our previous episode was about our particular Spanish language. And when I looked up some information for the show notes, I came across an article that you had co-authored.
Uh-huh.
And so the conversation that we had was kind of more about sort of the not so academic. It was not really more of an academic conversation. It was more about people's feelings about
Oh,
this language and their relationship to it, whether that be they face discrimination speaking it in schools, that they, like you said, were not, their Spanish was not accepted as a correct language requirement that their college, for example, required. They didn't count New Mexican Spanish as, it didn't
yeah.
qualify. All the way to someone like me, and I think is common in my generation, who doesn't speak Spanish at all, who was never taught Spanish, it wasn't spoken in the home because of the previous generation's discrimination that they faced.
Well, I would see so many students come into my classes and just crying and saying, you know, I don't, my parents wouldn't let us speak. They didn't let us. And I said, you have to understand why, because there was so much discrimination. They were punished in school. I mean, in my grade school, we were punished if we spoke Spanish. And a lot of kids just turned it off. And later on, maybe recaptured it. And it really depends on where you grew up, the family milieu. I lived with my grandparents. My great aunt and uncle kind of adopted me. I went to live with them, let's put it that way. I wasn't given away, although I write about it in the book. And that was the best thing that ever happened to me, including the Mexico thing. A year in Mexico, I came back feeling like I was Mexican, and I spoke Mexican Spanish. And then living with my grandparents, Spanish all the time. So I had just really strong speaking skills, and that helped me as I studied. But it's not true like of my sister, who has a book too. I'll share this with you. Same setting.
Mm.
Her perspective on our life out in Rosebud, and she virtually had to relearn it. And it's always been very painful to her, although she's now in Spanish. She was also a professor, a PhD in Spanish. But yeah, our people, it's a miracle that it survived as long as it did, but it stopped. And it's your generation virtually lost it, unless they live deep in barrios or in little communities up north, have some, you know. My daughter, she studied French in high school, and I took her one summer. I was doing a summer program in Spain, and I took her with me. I think she was 17 years old. She started studying Spanish, came back, and just started taking it in classes and classes. Ended up going to studying in Spain for a year or two. So she learned it. She learned it, and she's quite fluent. But she was fortunate because of my situation that I was able to give her the ability to do that. She's 55 now. So that generation, she would be kind of rare with her Spanish skills of New Mexicans. Uh, I think that's the generation, like the my generation's kids have lost, although some went back and recaptured it. So yeah, and it shouldn't have happened. But you know what? It's a miracle it lasted as long as it did. It really is because the we were a colonized people, and that's how we were treated. The battle for statehood. I have an article in the contested homeland on how it took New Mexico, from 48 to 12 to 1912 to become a state. They would not admit it into the Union. It was a territory because of racism, flat out racism. And so that we survived as the people conscious of our culture and our language is really amazing. Yeah.
So I did read your book, Rosebud, Population 7, and I have a lot I want to pull out from that. But it is interesting that you start out your intro to the book is a really beautiful perspective on recognizing that the journey of your ancestors and how they all sort of had to move. There was just so much movement because of a lack of resources, needing land, needing water, all that kind of stuff, and how that was a similar journey that your family had to take. And did you grow up with that perspective, or is that sort of you looking back?
Oh, that's all learned, from my intellectual studies, understanding the history of New Mexico, and demystifying this idea that we were just, Spaniards. I had a friend, Tony Mares. He was a poet. He was a wonderful person. He died rather young, and he used to call it the parachute theory, that Spaniards flew over, and then dropped in parachutes in New Mexico, and that it never changed. And of course, we have a different understanding of our history now, and that to me was really important. Learning that and trying to bring that to bear, just like Jose Antonio Esquivel. He does fabulous genealogy work, and I just watched something he did yesterday online, and that's one of his things, is to demystify that the simple notion that the Spaniards came to New Mexico, conquered all the natives, and there we are, 4 centuries later. It's much more complex, and I tried to get at that. I think if I'd written it after I'd looked at a lot of genealogy and Jose Antonio's stuff, I might have even worked it a little bit more. Yeah.
It is interesting. It throughout the book, you do refer to you and your family as Mexicans. Is that an intentional choice, or is that how
Yeah.
you saw yourself as a child?
In Spanish, we never used the word Hispano or Español. In the Spanish language, it was Mexicanos. Oh, I always used to tell my students in class, this is how there's a new neighbor moves into your neighborhood. And your parents would look out the window, and you want to know, are they Anglos or are they us? And they'd say, pues, ¿qué son? What do they say? Son Mexicanos in Spanish. We never used the word españoles or hispanos. Hispanos was for the out there, the newspapers of that. But at home, that was the word we used. And yeah,
Then
so
what,
we
but then I mean, you said that you studied like further migrations from Mexico, later migrations.
yeah,
What would they have referred to those people as?
surumatos.
Okay, that
Okay,
was
a
going to be my,
real derogatory term, you know. Uh,
that's what exactly I was going to ask, because that's what my grandmother called
oh,
them. And my dad grew up in Colorado Springs, so again, a
okay.
big factor into why he didn't retain the language as well.
Yeah, yeah. I know people from that area. Yeah.
And so they were his mother very explicitly forbade them from, and that's what she referred to them as, those children. And I'd never heard that word except for then when we did this interview about the language, and Charlene's Garcia Sims made said that name, and I said, "Oh my gosh, that's a word my grandmother used," but I've
Yeah.
never been able to find. I
It
even
even
I tried to find some kind of origin for it, and I could only find one little like blog post online or
that
something.
there was from a place called Suria. It's never been clear what it meant and if it had a negative meaning. But in New Mexico, the Suramatos, but it's fortunately died out of our
Mm.
vocabulary. I don't think you hear it anymore. Maybe, probably also Mexicanos. I mean, that, but in northern New Mexico, there was very little migration reaching there. And those who did come there
Mm.
had to really Hispanicize themselves fast. And met people that were adults already and, professionals. And in interviewing or talking or chatting said, yeah, my parents came from Mexico. I never knew. I thought they were native New Mexicans because they assimilated to our culture
Mm.
to avoid discrimination from us against them.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense because they were in the Springs, so there was because of the railroad.
Yeah.
There was a lot more. In fact, Charlene was saying because they came from Pueblo before they came to Colorado Springs, that in Pueblo early on there was actually a more recent Mexican migration, very small, but there was a presence in Pueblo very early on, and that they sort of coexisted in Salt Creek. And Mexico Town is actually a term I've seen when researching Pueblo records.
Uh-huh.
Anyways, that's a interesting point that unless you had some kind of like a railroad or something like that, there wasn't that
Well,
population.
it's really unfortunate that no one's done that research, looking at families that came to New Mexico from Mexico, over history, over the long trail there, and to document and to understand and to learn what their experience was, because eventually just blended in. And then the huge migrations into New Mexico, I said, as of the 70s, lots of populations. There's a lot of conflict there, still
Mm-hmm.
now, I
Mm-hmm.
think. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't live there, but I just sense that.
Yeah, I think I had a great aunt who got a job cooking along like the trails that the cowboys and all that would she
Oh,
would kind of start in Mexico and then cook for them as they came all the way up into like Wyoming. Um and she married one of those men, and I think that was a huge source of conflict in her
hmm.
family. Yeah. Anyways, okay, on to the book.
Well, but let
So
me just tell you
oh,
that uh, your comment that the life of my family, in a sense, was a replica of our ancestors, the moving, the searching for resources, the searching to survive. I'd never thought of it that way. So thank you
okay.
for doing that. Yeah.
So you refer to, so first of all, the book is called Rosebud. So I think I hadn't, because I remember seeing the book, hearing about it, and I don't think I had connected that to a Hispano settlement or experience because of the name of Rosebud, I guess. And now reading the book, you all moved around a lot. And so what was it about Rosebud specifically that sort of was is that because you were a little bit older when you lived there, that's the place that were you most put down roots or that most closely identified with or
That's a really good question. It's a big part of my childhood, my formation, and I suspect the centrality of my mother. She was
mm,
the teacher there.
mm,
We went there. We would have never gone there except for a job, and my mother would not get hired in Roy. She occasionally was brought in to substitute at the Catholic school. She would not get hired because they didn't hire people like us.
mm,
And she had to quit teaching, and that was her passion. Brought up the kids, and there was a superintendent, a friend of the family, who came one day and said, "I need a teacher in Rosebud. Will you go?" She said, "Yep, we're gone." And we went there. And my dad was a floater. I mean, a cowboy who had a hard time making it in the other world. And at that time, I don't think he was working. And well, he grew cantaloupes and watermelons and went to Las Cruces and got chili and drove all over selling that stuff. And so my mom got the job and we moved there. And we spent 4 years there. She spent 6 years there teaching. And that's those are the strongest memories I have of my childhood. It's in that school, that isolation. I mean, you can't imagine how isolated we were. And there was just that little schoolhouse and a house and then our little house and that was it. And we would go in the summer and lie out in the fields and watch the clouds and see this tremendous isolation. But it molded us. And what it did is it gave us firsthand exposure into the Anglo culture. So that was our acculturation, which might not have happened the same way had we gone to Roy, because Roy, a small town, I never mentioned it, that name. I only
Is
call it
that
town.
that's what
Cut,
town is? Okay, that was my next question was town was Roy. Oh,
yeah, cut
interesting.
it because I have some nasty things to say about that. I mean, it was really it wasn't racist overtly, but they knew how to keep us in our place. Everything kept us in our place. We were able to work, we were able to study, we were able to, but we knew we were second class. And so going to Rosebud, yeah, we were immersed in all the cowboy, all the ranchers were Anglos, but uh, because my mother was the teacher, we had status. So we achieved a kind of equality. And that I think was very formative for us, for my sisters and myself.
And I wanted to talk about the sort of concept of querencia.
Oh, okay, yeah,
I'm probably
yeah.
not saying that right.
That's yeah, querencia. It's okay, querencia.
And
Like we say, que, like what? Querencia. Okay.
and so I'd seen that term before. I think maybe I was conflating it with herencia, but this prompted me to look up the actual definition, and what a beautiful concept. And is that what you felt about Rosebud? And that was that sense of
I never,
home and
I never thought of it that way, but it was like our society. We all grew up in societies. Was our family, our isolated family, and then exposure to the other families in the school. I'd never thought of it as querencia. I associate that with our native culture, querencia. And the people who started that term were the people up in Budo, and there Esteban Arellano and Tony Mare, some of those people who started writing about our culture and this concept of querencia and the depth of it. Yeah, it's something the idea and even the term I learned in my studies, and I learned from these colleagues and these friends, these other writers. Yeah,
a place where one feels safe, strong, and happy, like being at home.
yeah. Well, and I suppose that it would apply to Rosebud, although there are memories of just desolation and my mother dragging us out in the middle of a storm that could have been a tornado in the middle of the night to find a place to sleep because we were afraid the roof would blow off the house, the little place, little dumpy place we lived in. They moved it from Los Alamos, a kind of not a Quonset hut, but these little huts that I, like military, for families that were working up there. And it was a 2 bedroom and just a little. And I have neuropathy, and I think it was from the atomic from living in a house that came from Los Alamos. But
Oh my gosh.
yeah, there was a lot of desolation in the growing up. A lot of, but there we were. We had familia.
Mm.
And we had a supportive community because mom was the teacher. Yeah.
So your parents got married in Clayton.
They eloped. Yeah.
And so my family's from Clayton.
Oh,
My
okay.
Pachecos are from Clayton.
Pachecos. Okay.
Uh-huh. So the Pacheco Ranch north of Clayton was my started by my great grandfather.
well, they probably, came into contact when my grandparents were ranching out in Bueyeros. It was because Bueyeros was part of Colfax County for a while. I don't know if you
Yes.
knew
And
that.
I go to Clayton and look through newspapers, for a vacation or whatever. And so there's a lot of stuff about, because that was the other church. In fact, Clayton didn't have a church. The
Okay.
churches were in Bueyeros and then Moses.
Yeah.
And it
Okay.
was a long time before Clayton got their own church. So I was dying. That's been on my list for a long time. So it was exciting to finally visit Bueyeros and see this
Did you
church.
ever go to the Mesa del Cerrito, the mass at the Butte every summer? There's a sandstone butte out there with a cave, a natural indentation, and they do a mass on Saint in July. So it's or I don't even know, but they do a mass there every year. My aunt, who's 90 some years old, still is in charge of that. It's fabulous. This summer, if you get a chance to go to that, um,
True.
do,
Where
because it's
is it?
quite beautiful. It's in Bueyeros,
Oh, oh, well, we must have
and
just
it's
missed it because we were
called,
there. We were there over July 4th weekend.
well, it's a little later. It's one of the saints, the St. John something, and it's every year, and it's maybe a few miles from the church. It's a sandstone butte that just sits out there by itself. And there's another butte, which is where I wrote about a relative being buried up on top of this butte, cemetery in the sky. It is called. I've been up there because my dad forced us to go up there. We were grown up and everything, and we went to Bueyeros to a family reunion, I think, and at the ranch, at my aunt's ranch in Bueyeros, and he took us there, and he said, "You climb up there," and there was like this narrow crevice, and we had my sister and I pull and push, and we went up to the top, and there was a couple of burial sites, and you know how they
Oh,
used to
wow.
put beds, the ironworks from beds. Have you ever seen that in
Mhm.
cemeteries? It was really a custom in the old, and I didn't know why they did that, but I read somewhere that it was when couples died, they put that bed thing so that they could sleep together. I don't
Oh,
know how true that is. That's you know, but yeah, but if you get a chance, do that because it's truly magnificent.
yeah, we loved that trip. It was really great. We went to Mills Canyon. We went through
To
Rosebud.
Mills Canyon, isn't
Uh-huh.
that something? That's
It
gorgeous.
really is.
That's where my mom's side of the family first settled, and I have uncles, I have relatives who have ranches up as you come out of the canyon, right on top there.
Oh, wow.
A hundred and some, 101 year old anniversary this year. Yeah,
Oh, yeah, I think we kind of try to connect with him because great storyteller. And of course,
Gilbert or
I would love to, yeah, I just turned 100 or 101.
yeah, that's my
Um,
primo.
oh,
Oh
yeah,
yeah.
to capture some of his stories. I don't know if anyone's
Oh yeah.
captured some of his stories, but
Hey, good. I'm glad you did that. I think my sister might have interviewed him, but yeah,
yeah,
wonderful.
we're
I
we're
was
hope
sorry I couldn't go to that. Yeah, to
we're
his
hope
celebration.
yeah, hoping to connect with him at some point. Yeah, and then we stayed at the rectory in
And
um
Mosquero,
Mosquero. Yes.
Tuda Libby, one of my classmates in Rosebud from the Libby
Oh,
family,
oh my
owns
gosh.
owns that. Yeah, the
Yeah, it
rectory.
was really exciting because actually,
She turned it into the B&B. Yeah, I've stayed there.
yeah, oh, it was so fun. It was really magical. I dreamed of priests while I was staying there. It's a little weird. Um, yes, and actually, my family lived at the Pacheco Ranch up north of Clayton, but we did have some marriage records that we couldn't find, and it turns out they were married at Mosquero. So I think maybe they did, for some reason, they went that distance to be married at the church at Mosquero instead of Moses or
Well,
Bueyeros, or
the priest was probably, when did they marry?
that would have been
Around.
1920s.
Okay. No, I don't know. I've known other, yeah. I, And they have good records. I've heard the marriage records for Bueyeros. I haven't looked at the, I mean, for Clayton, for Mosquero. I don't think uh, we ever had a lot to do, although I had relatives. I had an uncle and his daughters lived in Mosquero. Yeah.
It was a really, I loved you talk about going to mass at the church in Bueyeros and the picnic, community picnic afterwards.
Yeah. That was always
It's
fun.
really amazing having just been to that church, and it is very desolate to.
Uh, yeah, I have a lot of relatives, not some relatives buried there. Most of them had moved to town, we'll call it town, and are buried there, which is, I think it's really sad that they didn't go back, buried to be buried in Bueyeros.
Hmm.
And my parents died in Albuquerque, and we said, "Do you want to go to Roy to town, check to town, to be buried with your parents?" And they chose not to. You'll
Hmm.
never visit us. So yeah, they're not. They didn't go back.
Okay. And then we did talk about this for a second, but I do think it's interesting because it says it's a work of fiction, and so you explained that you didn't want it to be a narrator centric
Yeah,
memoir, more to
yeah,
have these people sort of be able to tell their stories and to speculate a little bit. And I have always felt a little bad about all the wild speculation that I do about my ancestors because I'm just making stuff up really. But I did recently go to a play that was written by my high school English teacher, and it was her speculating, taking some family stories that she knew of and making them into a play. I mean, dialogue about how her grandparents met and their courtship, and a story about her great grandmother having to go to an asylum and what that, and like basically bringing all of that story to life with imagined dialogue, imagined confrontations and tender moments and all the joy and the pain. And it's kind of making me think, and same thing with what you just said, it's making me think differently about my ancestors, that allowing that imagination or that spirit to kind of be imbued in just like what's names and places and records, but to animate them with real
yeah.
people and bring them to life.
I suspect that's what's now being called historical fiction. My sister and I just had a big old, went around on that. I said, I don't understand historical fiction. History is supposed to stick to the facts, although we know that people, make mistakes or they do stuff from a newspaper, which was a lie anyway. I said, but I can't. Well, what you're talking about is historical fiction. That's it. That's new in genre. So, and I'm really into this idea of genre bending. I call it genre bending. The movie, uh, Ramos, what's the new movie on Netflix of with Zoe Saldana, that, in the middle of telling the story, she breaks out into song. If I want to see a musical, I'll go to the theater to see a musical. I don't want to see it in my movies that tell the story. It's like genre bending. I'm learning to deal with it. It was fun. So the historical fiction, when you're saying we go back and I mean, a lot of the stuff like that I wrote about the grandmother coming out to work on the farm and help us out, and that I remember those things. Those things happened. Um, but a lot of things you just have to embellish. You have some stories, you have some ideas, but you weren't there. And the people who tell you these stories, some of the stories that were passed on to me, my parents may not have been there, but they told the stories, retold the stories. And so the idea of, so all this not forgotten is just somehow put it on paper for future generations, and to have an idea of what life was like for our people.
Yes, and I am so grateful because my dad was very disconnected from his family, from his heritage, from his culture. I really knew absolutely nothing about any of my ancestry or anything until 2012. And so I don't have these kinds of stories. I don't have any way to connect to what their lives were like. I only have records. I only have names, dates, places. I read the newspapers to try to give them a little bit of, fleshing out. So I'm so grateful for, because my family was from this part of the country too, and probably had very similar experiences. And then thinking about things like what that transition would have been like when you had the subsistence ranching or subsistence farming, and then the world is changing and the economy is changing, and that you had this sort of new influences and brought into New Mexico that made that way of life impossible. And so then what do you do? And trying to kind of figure that out. Um
And we lived that. I mean, we lived that, going from that subsistence uh, economy and living to moving into a town where my father only had cowboy skills. He was a rancher, he was a farmer, and there he finds himself, and then has spent his life looking for a way to survive. And the probably the best years for him are the ones he spent in Mexico, because he would work with uh, the people in the pueblos who had animals, and he was in a rural setting, helping them vaccinate the animals and stuff. I'm sure that was the highlight of his life after he left the ranch. Yeah. And I often think about that, how, and yet he thrived. He supported us. He was there for us. And 5 girls, you can do anything you want. You can be anything you want. So,
yeah, it's also interesting to think about. I mean, right now our society's experienced so much change as well. Even in my lifetime, just the advent of technology and how all, when I was growing up, we didn't have computers or cell phones, and now that's how we live our lives. And so I think we have a lot of it's very destabilizing for people, a lot of change like that. And there's a sort of expectation that things should stay the same. And
yeah.
the way that we grew up, or the way that we were living, is though has how we're always going to live or should always live. And our ancestors' stories sort of give us a good model that that's not how life works or the world
Yeah.
works. There's change, and you have to adapt.
And
And
you adapt and you accommodate.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a really valuable story, I think, right now. As we're all sort of trying to learn how to change and adapt
Well,
and
I
pivot.
think
And
for people from your generation, it's particularly, I mean, for us, my husband and I, we say, well, we don't have that much time here. We're not going to see that much change, and it's not going to affect us. But certainly our daughter, they will go through tremendous changes, and you will. And yeah, and it's got to be, a little bit scary and challenging, but that's where we're at.
so in the book, your family moved quite a bit, or had different, I would say, different experiences. You had sort of your life on a ranch in northeastern New Mexico, then you had to move into town. And then you're in that struggle to find employment after you had to move off of the ranch. Your dad got a job in Mexico. Can you talk a little bit about that experience and what that job was, and what your experience was living there?
There was this big infection of hoofed animals in Mexico called the hoof and mouth disease. And they were trying to eradicate it. And the US government got really nervous about it crossing the border and infecting animals here. So they sent uh, people down to work with the Mexican government to try to help them eradicate this disease. And they were very smart, went into Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and they recruited Hispano men, Mexicano men who had been ranchers had been, most of them were displaced ranchers. They hired them, U.S. government, good pay, expenses paid. You could take your family. So my dad went down. He got there. He just, it was like heaven to him. And my mother was pregnant, so we couldn't go till she delivered our youngest sister. And once she delivered her, he sent for us. My uncle, my aunt drove us down, and we went to this. I mean, we couldn't even, had never imagined a world like that, and it was fabulous. It was just amazing. They went to something called the American School, I think it was called, and it was supposed to be a bilingual school, and it was. They were probably paying tuition. I don't remember. Must have been though. And then, yeah, a while we went to a Catholic school, and that was pretty scary. But this neighborhood that we lived in, it was a nice neighborhood, really nice, and there were apartments, and a lot of the families who were in this program were living there. So we were among Americans, and some of them. I use the word Anglo-Americans because I grew up with that. I understand all the issues, but we know, I think, what we're talking about. So those were the women my mother hung out with, and because we all lived in those apartments. But as kids, we just spread out and met all the kids in the neighborhood and interacted. And I became Mexican. I wouldn't even admit to them that I was from the United States. I knew there was a lot of ill feelings towards Americanos, and I just chose to become Mexican. And because my Spanish was so good from my childhood experience, I was able to blend in, and it buried Mexico in my heart as a very beautiful place and just a wild experience living. It was a big city, Guadalajara. And then at the end of this deal, my dad was transferred to a little village too far for him to be coming home on weekends. So he moved us there, a little tiny Mexican village. We were only there a couple of months, and my mother did the schooling then before we went to this American school, this bilingual school, or the nun school. And then it was time to return because his dad sent for him. He says, I'm on my deathbed and you need to come home. I think my father would have, had not been for that, he would have remained there. I would have probably just be living in Mexico today. But he came back, and it was it was painful, but at the same time, we had grandparents, we had family, we were coming home. So it was, I think, an important experience in our lives. Yeah.
Yeah, because you talk about learning from, I don't know if it was in the schools or from, you mentioned your maid
Yeah.
taught you a lot of stories about Mexican history and Mexican folklore. And I just like, I can't, it was so fascinating to think of, when you're talking about growing up as a child, how much did you learn about your ancestry, your heritage, or have any sense of who you were, who you came from? Because that's very important to a child's sense of self and self-esteem. And you had this extra experience where you further learned about these experiences or stories that go back even to your further ancestors and how that
Well,
informed your sense of self.
I've got to admit here an anachronism, as my husband would say when we're watching movies. That's an anachronism that does not belong there. It's those stories, especially the one about the quelites and stuff. Our maid didn't tell us that. She was a young, probably illiterate woman. But that's the. I have to move my computer over here, I think, that so it reaches the plug. That was the academic me. Let's face it. It was, me, the professor, all that I'd learned through my studies, and that's what I include in the book. Yeah, that's why I call it fiction.
Well, it
I
is.
mean,
I
some
mean, it's
things, yeah, and a lot of the things we learned were through taking us to the villages and to the celebrations and the pilgrimages and that kind of stuff. So we did get imbued into the native culture in that way. Uh, but to learn about the history and the ancestry of Mexico, I don't think very much at that age. I was pretty young, maybe in school. I don't remember.
Let's see. I also, okay, so the sisters you refer to would have been from the Roy Convent that
Yeah,
you went
right.
briefly, you went at some time you went to Catholic school in
We
Roy.
started out, it started in Catholic school, then went to Mexico, then came back and went to Catholic school again till we moved to Rosebud. Yeah, so we went to school there in that big convent and quite a few nuns. Yeah,
Well, I think
it was important.
that's my favorite photo. We were talking about City of Dust. That's my favorite City of Dust photo is of the Roy Convent.
The
And
convent.
so that is, but it's so it's evocative because it's on its huge building on its own in the middle of nowhere in the plains. So being able to again animate that experience that there were nuns there and but I love your that perspective that they were all Anglo and they didn't allow you to speak Spanish. And then that's where they changed. There was a lot of name changing. Like they wanted to have
Oh
a sort of
yeah,
English
yeah,
type of
yeah.
name.
My mother's name is Carlota, and they called her Carlita. My mother's official name on all her, she signed her name Carlita till, but at home, I never heard my dad call her that. She was Carlota, and in public, she was Carlita. Yeah, they changed their names. They didn't change my name, fortunately. But the other kids, or I alluded to that, maybe they weren't
Mm-hmm.
changing names. But in the summer, they'd have like these conferences or I don't know what, but nuns from all over would come and stay there a week or so. And I would go to the playground at this Catholic school, and the nuns would be out there on the swings and the teeter totters in their habits. And I was just like, oh, I want to be a nun. It was fun. Yeah. They were important in our lives. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so
But the
interesting
other
to
one,
think
the one
about.
that I call Attila, she was crotchety, but one of them I loved. Yeah, I really loved.
Yeah, I think two of the name changing examples I have in my family, the Rosa became Rose, and
Rose.
then
Yeah,
Pablita became Pauline. I actually,
exact. My family, two of those, a
yeah, I
Pauline
have
and
my mystery, my on my Romero side, my great great grandmother, who I cannot find anywhere, is listed in both of the records I have for her as Pauline Vigil. And so I don't know what her real name would have been. I mean, it could be Pablita or Paula or Paulinaria. Um,
hmm,
but it's
uh,
just so fascinating. And I didn't know too. I've heard that some people change their own names to sound more American.
I'm sure. Yeah.
I know my grandmother was Ignacia, and then she went by Nash as a young person.
Hmm,
But at some point, she became Mary.
interesting.
And I always assumed that when I found her record, she would be Maria Ignacia. But I
Interesting.
finally found her baptismal record, and she was Ignacia Josefa. There was no Maria. There was no, she just made, I guess,
Interesting.
either made it up or somebody gave her that name. Um,
The the grandparent, the aunt and uncle that I grew up with, or that I spent several years with, were Vigil.
oh, really?
Yeah, from a lot of them in Bueyeros in that area. They were part of the founding families there. And we are
Mm.
probably related, well, through marriage, definitely, but probably even closer ties to the Hill families.
Yeah, I'm still tracking her. I think I'm gonna have to use DNA to track that family down because I just can't
I've
find
done a
them.
little bit of genealogy and just trying to track my family down. I'm not very good at it. I don't know how to do a lot of it, but it's pretty fascinating and it's amazing. And I have discovered for sure one Aztec grandmother, great,
Oh,
great, 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 and
interesting.
possibly a second. I'm still not sure that that line is all documented in family because I do the family search on what is it, the Latter Day Saints thing.
Hmm.
I'm not sure because other people come in and put stuff, so I have to verify that. But I think I found a second uh, woman. Mexican, probably from the heart of Mexico, who married soldiers or men from when they came up with Oñate, the first and the second entry. Yeah, I've been able to. So I was so excited when I found those Aztecs grandmothers. I was really excited because I've studied Mexican culture so much and taught it. And I thought,
Hmm.
oh my gosh, that's great. But I think I have to do that other DNA thing that'll pinpoint it. Yeah.
Hmm. Okay, a couple of features that you highlight, which I really appreciate. So you talk about gathering quelites.
Yeah.
And how did you? So I'm curious about this because my dad said that they did gather them in Colorado Springs. And I was like, how did you know what to gather? Did your mom like show you what? Because it had to be, wouldn't it be different based on the area? Like in Mexico, they have quelites that are different than what you would gather in New Mexico,
But
which are different what you gather
in
in Colorado.
in the plains, the whole plains, including Oklahoma and that whole, they were just, it's called what is it in English? Uh
Lamb's
oh,
quarters,
what?
lamb's
Lamb
quarters.
quarters. Lamb quarters. Yeah. So it just grew everywhere. And people would pick them and cook them. And I grew up in a family where there'd be a big batch of calites, and you just learn to identify the look. And but it was scattered all over the high plains. So
Mm.
they were just, like cactus in the south. And you just
Mhm.
learned what they were and you gathered them. And we had quelites, a little bit of bacon, a little bit of lard and a little bit of bacon, cook
Mm.
them up. I don't
Okay.
do them that way. Well, I haven't had any
Okay.
for ages, but yeah, they were a favorite. Yeah,
Okay.
quelites.
Okay, and then you talk about a ritual of splitting clouds. So I think there was a storm and there was a lot of hail, and your mom or your grandmother.
They all did it. It was a practice. If cloud, there's a huge storm, they went out. My sister's story, she claims that grandmother took a handful, the box of salt out. I didn't. They take a handful of salt, go outdoors, throw the salt up in the air, and cut across, and that would um, take the storm away. And I've witnessed it. I mean, we witnessed it. They used to do it when we lived out on the ranch. When we moved to town, I don't remember keeping that up, but my sister writes in her book that grandma did it in town. Yeah, so that was, and I don't know other people who have documented that, but I've read about it, and then they would that little um, Santa Bárbara Doncella, protectenos del rayo y la centella. Saint Barbara, please protect us from lightning and thunder. And so that comes down in the lore. So I'm sure that people practiced it all over. It'll be interesting to ask others.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's part of the point of the podcast is to sort of document some of those types of things, and then
Maybe other
let
people will.
maybe other people have the similar stories or
Yeah.
and then you mentioned Brujas a couple of times, and there was in particular a woman in town you thought might be a Bruja, and you and your sisters were gonna try to trap her.
Oh, the Bruja stories, we just lived with that. It was part of our reality. And you live in a town where you don't know who is and who isn't. And that one story about the man that hits the owl, and that was a story. I mean, that happened. And he came and told the story. And there was one woman, and she wore black. Women still, some of them wore those black bonnets, like you see the pioneers, and dressed in black. And she was really mysterious. She lived alone, of course. And she was a kind of old woman. She was lovely, but we thought she was a witch. And so she was coming to visit grandma, and we did the whole. I don't know how we learned it, but that's what you did. If you wanted to across needles over the door, or a broom, and they were not crossed. I don't know where I learned that, but that's in the lore, New Mexican lore. If you
Mm.
probably do some research on brujeria in New Mexico, it was big stuff. It was important in our growing up. They were there supposedly,
So
you know.
what was it about a woman that made her suspected to be a witch?
She lived alone. She was independent, and she dressed in black, total black from head to toe, and a long dress. I mean, she was just weird.
Yeah, as far as
Oh,
I
but
can tell, for the ones that my dad and his brother thought in the neighborhood, it was like sisters who lived alone. Basically, the women living alone is suspicious
that,
historically.
that's it. You got to watch for those
It still
single
is.
women that don't need a man because they need other power, right? So we grew up with, and the story mom told about the lady who died. That was one of my favorite stories. I could just picture it, and they go and they follow this ember because sometimes witches reveal themselves in a ball of fire. That was a common belief.
Mm.
And so this ember is skipping right to this lady's house, to the velorio, the wake at her home. They go in, and so they know that the witch who killed her, who's responsible for her death, is in there somewhere, but they don't know who she is. That was
Mm.
one of my favorite stories that she told us.
Mm.
And
And
then the
then
Llorona, that's the other one, of course. I mean, she was just in our lives, the wailing woman, and she was sometimes just horrible and very often sexualized, like in this story, where she comes after the young boy. And those are just stories that we heard. That was part of our lore. I mean, we had rich storytelling tradition. We tell you these stories, and the people who would bury, they had a big pot of gold and they'd bury it in their backyard, and then at night it would glow, and things like that. And when I lived with my great aunt and great uncle, they were the source of the stories. They told me great stories.
mm, yeah, it's so valuable. And then some of your aunts had remedies, like when you went down to Mexico and they put the egg on your belly and had the
Yeah, that was a big
tea.
one. If your kid was sick, they'd roll around this egg on your belly. I had never knew what it was supposed to. That you had a blockage and the egg would land on where the blockage was, and then you could massage it. Uh, and then the other remedio, my grandmother did the trementina, and it's the pitch in pinon trees, black pitch. It's a sap, black gooey stuff, and you go out and gather it. You put it, keep a jar, and you use that for everything, especially for drawing out poison. My grandmother, they claim, was that she got a lump on her breast, and the doctor said, well, I think the local doctor, you have cancer, and she just did her trementina, and it drained it out. And if you had, it was a draining, it would suck out. And then when I met my husband, he gets styes, and so his mom had bought this medicine. It's called Ixamol, and so we'd always buy Ixamol. It's a black gooey stuff. And when I went and bought it, and I said, what the heck is in this? And I looked, pine pitch or whatever. Yeah, it was the stuff that was now being manufactured by pharma and sold. That
Wow.
was one of the biggest remedios. Oh, I didn't write about the apples in vinegar for fever. You slice the apples, you put them in vinegar, you put them on your forehead, wrap your forehead. That'll take care of your fever and your headaches. Yeah, we grew up with a lot of that stuff. That's probably why we survived because they had remedies. And my grandmother was a partera. She accompanied the local doctor on birthing, and we were born. She delivered us at home. Five sisters, three born at home.
So the difference between that's they were specific like a curandera or a curandero um had skills and gifts beyond just like your basic remedies that people would use at home.
Yeah, and I think those were just passed down and down and down. And when I think of that, well, the story on some of these Aztec women that came up with, uh, with soldiers or with Spaniards or already Mexicanized Spaniards to New Mexico, were very often accused of witchery, of being witches. And that's probably because they brought all these remedios, all these remedies from Mexico. And I'm sure now I think that's what they passed down. And that's when my grandmother did those
Mhm.
remedies. It probably goes way, way back. So it was knowledge, native knowledge before medicine, and fortunately, people were passing it down. You know,
Mm.
and I don't know if people still do it. I haven't put vinegar on my head for a long time. I did as an adult. We used to, but and if I had Trementina, I'd sure be using it.
I was gonna
You know,
say, where can I get some of that?
you're just going to go pick pinon, which I'm sure Colorado is big. This year, everyone on my Facebook friends from Colorado are posting tons of pinon. Look for the pitch,
Mm.
the black tar or pitch it's called.
Mm. Well, thank you so much for sharing all this. I'm just so grateful for those who have. I know you said before that you were inspired by Sandra Cisneros to sort of gather some of these stories, and I find that very inspiring. That
Well, I just want to tell you that you're the only adult that has spoken to me about my book. I mean, I have a couple of friends who said, "Oh, this was great. I loved it," but no one's. It just went unnoticed. So when you contacted me, I thought, "Holy smokes!" Yeah. So I thank you for recognizing it, for going through the trouble of reading it and understanding it, and for contacting me. I really, really appreciate this.
yeah, there's so much in there. And I mean, I think aspects of our culture that you're right have been lost, or we need to pass those down, especially to someone like me who is trying to do some of that recapturing of lost culture and language and all that. And then also for this particular part of New Mexico, because my family was from there too, there's just not very much written about it. You can't really find a whole lot of history about it, and so that's so valuable to have documented some of those experiences in life for a lot
Well,
of our people out there.
what I'd really like to see is this book used in schools for our kids, with our kids, so that they could learn about their people's culture. And I just am not a marketer, but I think I've thought a lot about translating it.
Well, I really loved all the Spanish that was within the English version. It really, I had to have my phone with me the whole time
Yeah.
to look up certain words. I could kind of make out, I mean, like your daughter, I took Italian and well, I took Latin in high school and then Italian in college. I think for like a boy or something like that. Um, because again, I just didn't know anything about my ancestry. I of course now wish that I had learned Spanish, although part of the discussion in our previous episode was about I have a desire to learn Spanish, but I would like to learn the Spanish that's specific to our culture rather than learning,
Yeah.
what you would get at the community college or whatever. And so I think a lot of people feel that way. And so we had discussed, is there a possibility to create some kind of like a online class or Rosetta Stone or something like that
It
for,
exists. It exists. My sister, who's the author of On Top of the Windmill, she ran the Heritage Language Program at UNM, and she had an institute in Taos on Spanish in Summer Institute, but she has classes, uh, online classes on for native speakers. So a lot of people like you sign up for her class who are New Mexicans who have lost language and who want to learn it, but are to start with interested in Well, she teaches standard Spanish, but she could relate it to the language and do the comparisons and help understand. So I'll send her name and the title of her book. You might want to
Yay.
take a look at that. And hers is truly memoir. It's, you know, narrators centered. And I think we agree on most things. Um, See things. Hers is a little different because she spent more time alone out in Rosebud. She was there 6 years. When the other sister and I left to go away to boarding school, she stayed behind with mom, and the two youngest alone out there because my dad was working in town. He'd come home on weekends. So yeah, hers was a little bit different, I think. Well, thank you so much. You have no idea how happy I am to meet you and to talk to you and
Yeah, it was
have you
so
ask. And,
great.
and I've learned some things about my writing from you. Yeah,
Yeah, and it's
that's
so fun because you described the eye color of your mother and your grandmother, and I can tell in your eye color. It's really fun to.
yeah. Mine are sort of are green. No one in the
Mhm.
family got the grandma's eyes. Her, a brother, and then the brother that died by lightning.
Mm.
Three, and then I found her father. He was a mystery, and through my genealogy work, I finally found him, and I found a photo of him, and you can tell that his eyes were probably blue. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, it's just because
I
you.
mean, they were light, in those whole photos, you can tell when it's a lighter color. It shows up,
Mhm.
although not as the color, but his were really stood out like my mom's. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you do such a good job. The book is so lived in. Like, I feel like I've been hanging out with these people and gotten to know them. And so it's been exciting. I can see a photo of them now.
And see, this time I have not felt that this book had any value
Oh,
to adults, especially to adults. So you've
oh,
made my day.
I've been loving
you've,
it. Yeah,
you've
I've
made my
really,
holidays.
really been
Okay,
loving
great.
it.
And there's some interesting stuff on the settlements up above Roy, uh, out there where they started the sheep ranches and stuff. And some guy's done some, I can pass it on to him, some interviews with all these ranchers from that area. And they interviewed my father. It's got 3 hours of interviews with him that talk
Wow.
real early stuff. And there's some interesting stuff up there around. It's where the ancestors settled, that ranch in the Bueyeros area, and up around Mosquero of penitente sites. That there's some old
Ooh.
chapels, and that they were very active. My family's did not on my dad's side because the landowners, they didn't do that kind of stuff. But yeah, there's some history there that is waiting to be dug up.
Okay. Well,
You
wow.
know.
We'll definitely have to do another episode then.
Okay, great. Good talking to you,
Well,
and
thank you
have
so
a good
much.
holiday.
Thanks for listening to Luminaria. You can reach me at luminariapod@gmail.com. Our intro and outro music is of Varsoviana, performed by Nieves Anaya and his daughter Ernestina Anaya at Arroyo Hondo, New Mexico in 1940. It's part of the Juan Bautista Rael collection at the Library of Congress.